just do it now, but yeah. Okay.
Hello. And welcome to the
Stop Talking.
That didn't work out at all.
I'll be back there later.
That one will go in your bloopers reel for the end of the year,
definitely.
guys. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. Should we go one more time? Let's go.
All right. Hello and welcome to the Stop Talking Shit podcast.
Episode 6, guys.
So exciting.
Yay.
This is our third guest episode. It is our third guest episode. It is. Right. Yep.
That's right.
Today we have someone very exciting with us. We're probably more excited than you guys are. We're fangirling at the moment. So let's give Jessica, J. Stokes Parish, a little bit of an introduction. She is a practicing intensive care nurse and educator, and she holds a PhD in medicine from the University of Newcastle. She's got 13 plus years of experience in bedside nursing. And her areas of work include health professions, workplace development, including policy, education, and science communication. Formally, her qualifications include a Bachelor of Nursing, a Master in Nursing, graduate certificate in critical care nursing, and a Doctorate of Philosophy. Quite a story and a journey you've got there.
I've got another one coming too.
Oh, tell us a little bit about that.
I'm doing a graduate certificate in science communication.
Wow.
Amazing. How long does that go for, Jess?
Oh, look, you can do it in 6 months if it's a full load, but I'm spreading it out over a few years.
As you would.
Yeah.
As busy as you are.
Makes it a little bit manageable.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your academic journey and what led you to your passion in science communication?
Yeah, for sure. Well, firstly, thanks so much for having me on the pod. I'm very excited, and I'm glad that Iman and I have met in real life before. We've bonded over our ethnic backgrounds and cultural,
good coffee as well,
family and good coffee. It's kind of essential. So my academic background. So I went into nursing quite young, and I worked in oncology for a few years, got quite burnt out because I was around a lot of death quite a lot, and then moved into intensive care and realized after about 5 years, like I already knew that I wanted to move into education. I'd always loved education. And so one night on night shift, I was like, man, I've got to stop these night shifts. And so I was very grateful to get a job in a medical school. And that was what started my formal academic journey, really, in terms of the traditional sense of working in academia. I was very lucky to have a boss that mentored me and was very supportive and kind of showed me the ropes to academia. And that's kind of pushed me into my whole niche of science communication. And I guess there was probably catalyst moments where I realized that there was an opportunity, particularly on social media, to really engage with people and to give opportunity for people to engage with us as science per se. And so I just thought, well, why don't I try and see what happens? And that was where I kind of come from.
Yeah, it's so amazing how you can connect and meet with different people through social media as well, because that's sort of how I don't know how I stumbled across how we found each other's pages. But yeah, I remember I think early on you'd followed me and then I followed back, and then I started to learn a lot from your page and became really curious about like science communication and evidence-based practice and all that sort of stuff. And I think you joined in a really interesting time. It was sort of not long before COVID and all the things that happened around that. So I think that just consolidated, everything that you were already sort of leaning towards in terms of what you were passionate about and what space you wanted to work in. And I think there's just been so much that we've learned from each other sort of since meeting online.
Yeah.
Question: what's your HEC stat like?
Well, nursing is one of the cheapest degrees to do, and then the other ones I paid up front. I paid up front for my postgrads. Yeah.
So that's why you can do a grad cert. Gotcha.
Yes, that's right. And so I enrolled in the grad cert, and because it's a social sciences degree, they're normally $4,000 at a minimum per subject. And I thought, oh man, this is a lot of money to pay. So I enrolled and I thought, well, if I do one subject a semester, then one subject a year, then that's it for me. But once I enrolled, I got notified that I was a Commonwealth supported student, which reduced the price to less than $1,000 a subject.
Amazing.
So you got to do those Commonwealth supported places.
Yeah. I didn't actually ask before, Jess, what are you doing as far as work and employment at the moment? So I know that you were lecturing, I think, at uni, but tell us sort of what you're doing right now.
Yeah, so I work as a senior lecturer at Bond University. So we call them assistant professors here. We're kind of a little bit American.
Yeah.
And I am an educator in the health professions education. So I primarily work in medicine, but I contribute to the nutrition degrees, biomedical sciences, and a couple of others, mainly around my expertise in science communication. That's what I bring to those other programs. So in academia, so I work here full time, and then I do 1 day a week where I work clinical. Within my full-time role, I have a lot of leadership roles and do some teaching, and I do research as part of that.
Amazing. Busy.
Oh, it's really varied, so which I like.
Yeah, it keeps it dynamic, I think.
Yeah.
Bond University is one of the only universities that you don't have to, what do you call it? You don't need to sit a GAMSAT.
No, and that's deliberate because why do you need to do a GAMSAT if you've already got an ATAR of 99?
Awful.
So true.
Such an ugly exam. Oh my God.
Yes.
Yeah.
So no, we are one of the only universities that you don't have to sit the GAMSAT, but we do emotional intelligence testing as part of our admissions process.
Yeah. And I think that's fair given the stress that's already involved in going down a medicine degree pathway and all the years and time and effort that goes into that. Having to sit another exam is just, I think, a little bit unfair, to be honest.
Yeah. And look, I guess on balance, there's been research that's shown that doing an exam like that doesn't actually give us any additional information other than what's already expected. So
yeah, doesn't mean you're going to get a better doctor, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for introducing yourself a little bit more to our listeners, Jessica. Without further ado, let's get straight into some of the juicy stuff. So not long ago, I mean, you can give us a little bit of the background, but you came up with this iconic framework called C.R.A.B.S. Tell us a little bit about what C.R.A.B.S actually stands for, when you developed it, and what the inspiration behind C.R.A.B.S was.
Yeah, so C.R.A.B.S is essentially a mnemonic-based framework to help people to systematically assess information that they're seeing. And it encompasses the letters has a different issue that you should look at. So the first one being conflict of interest, then references, then the author, any buzzwords, which is like emotional aspects, and marketing jargon, and then scope of practice. So the reason why I developed this, so as you kind of alluded to earlier, I was already looking at this different framework. Like I felt that much of the science communication that was online was very patriarchal and very like it assumed that the public didn't know things, and it assumed that an individual didn't already have knowledge that they brought to these conversations, and you should just do what I say because I'm an expert. And I kind of looked at that and I was like, I felt uncomfortable with it because it felt dismissive, and it also ignores people's prior experiences, which are really important when it comes to health decisions. And so I started to think, what if we gave people the tools to assess information themselves and to think about information in a systematic way that they can then go, oh, maybe I should take a moment to think about whether I should apply this in my life. And so I'd started kind of playing around with, looking at red flags. What are some of the top things that I've seen online that indicate that information may not be reliable? And as time went on, and with lots of feedback from people on Instagram, I was able to create the C.R.A.B.S framework. And I thought what would be a really important piece of that is that it would be a memorable name and something that people could easily get to come to mind when thinking about information and decisions for their own health.
Yeah. I would definitely say that C.R.A.B.S lives rent free in my head every second of the day. And it's definitely like acronyms just stick so well. And what we can do is when we actually publish this episode, we can include the link to the C.R.A.B.S framework, I think, on your website, because you've got it there as well. But it really does help people in ascertaining, you know, how they can break down what they do see online. I know that I've used C.R.A.B.S before when in the online space. And it's something that's so simple, but easy for the everyday person to sort of implement. And when did you, roughly when did you actually come up with C.R.A.B.S? Was that like in the last year? Was that the year before?
It was the year before. So I published it in academic literature last year. Okay. So I think it was probably 2020, late 2020, that I kind of got to the point that I came up with the mnemonic, as opposed to just thinking about his 3 red flags to look for type thing.
Yeah.
Was that your PhD?
No, not at all. No. So this was just more, I don't know, in academia, if you don't publish something, somebody else will publish it. And so I realized that I needed to formalize it in some way. And there's still work to be done. Like, I'd like to do some studies around people's kind of thoughts on how easy it is to use, so and how applicable it is, so that we would call in academic world would be like feasibility and validity studies. So there's a little bit of work that I hope to do over the coming years to kind of make it even stronger.
Yeah, amazing. Hopefully that's an easy process to navigate as well. I know it's not easy getting things published and getting support sort of in that space as well. You've shared a little bit about your journey with that.
Yes.
Yep, the good times in academia. What are some common red flags or warning signs? So, you know, when we're chatting about research and studies, what are some of the common red flags or warning signs that indicate that a study or a claim might be unreliable or flawed? So if we're looking at it, you know, good science versus bad science, what are some sort of key things that you want listeners to look out for?
Look, I'd start with claims. So if we think about claims in the context of social media, many people make very strong and broad claims about things that might be emotive. So we'll see, you know, this product is toxic for your gut health. And so straight away you go, like, I need to stop using this. It's bad for me. It creates this kind of you know, concern inside you. So I would say one of the first things that can make a scientific claim concerning is that emotion and broad sweeping claim. Like, you know, I think collagen is a great example of discussions around applicability. So it's something that comes up in nutrition space, I'm sure for you guys in your space as well. And, you know, people say, oh, I've got to take collagen. It's essential for my whatever. And they'll make a very broad, vague statement about it. And my question is always, okay, but what type of collagen? What strain of collagen, in what format, and for what specific issue? And so I think, you know, what we know about collagen is that there are some circumstances that specific types of collagen work for very, very niche groups of people. And so that's a really common example that you'll see, is that people will make very broad sweeping claims that are vague, and that the telltale sign is that it's vague. Like, what does gut health mean?
Yeah.
You know, like, what does that mean?
Yeah, are we talking about, you know, your bowel movements? Are we talking about reflux? Are we talking about heartburn? We're talking about IBS? Like, are you getting cramps? Like, oh, like, what does gut health mean? And so we see lots of kind of vague, unspecified claims. And so the first thing that you can do is be like, okay, let's ask more questions. And let's think, okay, what do I mean by gut health? Okay, I'm getting some symptoms of reflux. Okay, well, let's start thinking about reflux. What's effective treatments for reflux? And then, you know, you kind of go down that way. So that would be one of them. Other red flags or warning signs, I think, are financial conflicts. You know, people sometimes get upset when you say, oh, well, you're selling it
so of course you like it. Well, yeah, because there is a bias that comes in with that, because you've got an investment in it. And it doesn't always mean that something is unreliable, but it's certainly a reason to think, okay, what would your benefit be by promoting this product? Are you going to get a direct financial or political benefit from promoting this particular product? And what I find more often not is like, all of us have conflicts. You could argue that I have a conflict because I run workshops on how to spot misinformation. So people will say, well, of course you want a C.R.A.B.S framework and this kind of assessment framework because you want to sell a workshop and you're going to make money from that. So, we all have conflicts. It's just about that relationship with that conflict and how does it actually change the decision-making that we do.
Such a great point.
My other thoughts are like from a study perspective. So thinking about studies, some of the common flaws that I see are that people share the abstract.
Yes.
So they'll reference a PubMed ID and they say, oh, it's on PubMed. And they share the link, which, by the way, PubMed is just Google search for journal articles. it's nothing special. It's a database. But you go and look at it and you can see that when you open it, that only the abstract is available to the public. So you have to assume that the person that shared that link actually hasn't read the whole paper.
Yeah.
So
and that's really common. And it is hard. Like, I think it highlights the complexity of access to science and the lack of access to important information. But other warning signs for me are that it's in vivo or in vitro studies, so lab-based studies, so either in an animal or in cells in a dish, that you can't use any of that information to make clinical decisions about your health. Or they're really small participant numbers, that it was a pilot study of 30 people to assess the feasibility. And, it's okay to get that stuff wrong and to not realize that that's the case, but they're kind of common pitfalls that I see.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the in vivo, in vitro, because I think there was recently a lot of information out about garlic and COVID-19. Did you sort of saw that? Yeah, and that was largely based on, I'm pretty sure that was test tube related studies, and everyone was oh, this intervention was hidden from you all along. Like, you could have just been using garlic.
That's the best.
Here we are, Lebos, eating garlic every single day with our food in COVID.
You should never ever get COVID if that's the hypothesis, then, right?
I don't know why.
No, so exactly. So I looked into that study, and it was a cell tube study. They were looking at different varieties of garlic and which one had better antiviral properties. Now, the reality is that when you've got a dose that's hundreds of times stronger than what you would eat, of course it's going to kill it. Like, I mean, you have a dose of caffeine that's thousands of times higher than what we actually drink. That's going to kill humans too. Same with water. But what it turned out was that Big Garlic sponsored that because they want to patent their garlic to sell at a premium price in supplements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So again, back to that financial
red
gain.
flag.
Yeah. Big garlic. I think that's something not our listeners would be hearing every day.
They talk about Big Pharma all the time.
Yeah.
And they don't talk about, I guess, the herbal supplement, how multi-million-dollar, that is, and how people get ripped off with that. We're always
supplements is
Big
like
Pharma,
wellness is like a multi-billion-dollar industry.
$1 trillion now. $1 trillion.
Wow. No way.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love garlic. I think garlic is needed and in high amounts in food, purely from a pleasure perspective.
Yeah. No, I agree. But are we, does that mean we're going to use it to fix our health problems? Probably not.
Well, whenever there's a big claim, it's more that it's going to be a cure-all, or it's just, if it's outrageous, it probably is outrageous. It's probably not going to do what it says it does. Science just doesn't work like that. It's not so broad as you said.
If anything, it plays things down until we've got more data.
It does. It's always what I mean? Like, well,
like this looks promising, but we kind of need a little bit more information in this. And that's what I like. I feel like I feel like good science is very humble in that way, in terms of like, this is
Mm.
what we think, and you know,
And
this is what we
specific.
think is
It's
happening.
very
Yeah,
specific. So for this particular and this particular, rather than gut issues, you know what I mean?
That's right. Yeah.
Um,
And that's right. And that's why I always say, like, what do you mean by that? What does that study actually mean? And what does it mean in that kind of context? Yeah, like, sure, bone broth is probably going to be great for you, because are you increasing the amount of liquid that you're consuming? Have you suddenly now meeting your hydration quota? But equally, if you're not careful, you might also have too much vitamin A and too much sodium. So, you know, you kind of got to get
so
that balance.
what about bone broth in IV drips? What do you think?
Oh no. Don't give them any ideas.
yeah, no.
See that going around the IV infusions and you know, the whole culture thing, you know,
Yeah,
like
we could,
I'm sitting here with my IV drip.
we could talk about
Oh
that.
yeah.
Yes.
That's a whole other story.
There's a lot
Yeah.
to, I think, on both ends. There's
Yeah.
to be made. There's financial gains to be made on both ends and on both claims. So it's not just, you know, big pharma and the conventional medical system. It's, you know, the wellness industry as well.
Yeah, and look, and that's the thing, like, and that's, I think, what kind of spurred on a lot of my kind of thoughts and conversations around this is, yes, like, some pharmaceutical companies will do the wrong thing. And yes, I'm not hiding that. I'm not saying that they don't. And I'm not saying that mistakes aren't made or that fraud doesn't happen. That's why we have these systems and checks and balances in place, so that we can be accountable and have ways to transparently explore them.
Yeah. In your experience, Jessica, what are some prevalent misconceptions, you know, while we're on the topic of looking at, you know, all these systems that are in place, especially when it comes to evidence and data, what are some prevalent misconceptions or myths about the scientific process that contribute to this confusion between, like, what is and isn't reliable, what is good versus bad science?
That's a good question. I think so. I think there's two things. I think on one hand, there's a common, like, let's think about vaccines, for example. It's a common misconception that they're poorly tested and that you're just experimenting on humans. And but we know that actually there's 4 stages to clinical trial process. There's a number of checks and balances that have to go through before even going to human trials. And then those human trials have to be replicated so many times. So on one hand, you've got this kind of idea that there's not enough checks and balances to look at something. And then on the other hand, you've also got commentary that there's too much checks and balances, and that, say, like, garlic is the perfect example. Like, garlic has been withheld. Well, no, it hasn't. It's just at that same 4-step process that we're talking about for vaccines. It's at step 1. And it's got quite a few more hoops to get through to bridge to step 2. And then it's got to go to 3 and then 4 before it could be a supplement and whatnot. And I think I look back and we look back at, say, the 1800s and the early 1900s, where, like, opium was just being doled out everywhere. And sometimes I see parallels in other industries, like people are so desperate. We've swung almost back to that time sometimes of, like, doesn't matter, I'm just going to experiment. I'll just put 10 drops of essential oils in my food and that will help. And it's like, but we don't know enough about whether that would be harmful for you. In fact, we do know that it could be quite disruptive to your gut lining in certain circumstances. So, like, it's like there's this duality. There's, on one side, there's not enough. And then on the other side, there's too much. And I just want to be able to have the autonomy to, you know, do whatever I'd like.
Yeah.
Yeah. I often hear, you know, when it comes to discussions about the scientific process, again, that, like, about funding is a huge concern as well. People will be like, oh, you know, big pharma, funded that research. So is that reliable? Big Dairy funded that research. So that's a common one that I often hear about when people are disputing or refuting evidence or research. They'll say, well, you know, how can we even trust the research if it's being, you know, funded in a particular way?
Yeah, and I think that's a valid concern to have, because if you have a pharmaceutical company who maybe hasn't been distant from the process, then there is a concern that there's a conflict there. So that's where, like, I've been a recipient of grant funding, not from pharmaceutical companies or anything like that, but in most cases, there'll be a governing body, and you go through this process of applying for the money, and then they'll grant you the money, and they then have nothing to do with it at all, except for saying you need to acknowledge us as providing you with the funding to be able to do this research. Now there's like there's a gradient. There's those kinds which are they're hands off, they're not involved. You might have others that say, no, because this is we're investing a lot of money in this, we would like to be involved in, you know, certain aspects of decision making and so on. And that's why when you're reading a paper that does declare that it's funded by an organization, you need to work out what involvement, and most good journals will ask, what type of involvement did the funding body have? Were they involved with the design of the study? Were they involved with the analysis? Were they involved with writing the results? And if the answer is they were not involved with the design, they were not involved with the actual, you know, study and the analysis and then the write-up, then you can be pretty confident that they're quite separate. You know, and there was a lot, rightfully, you know, for example, during COVID, there was a lot of criticism of the big pharmaceutical companies for releasing studies by press release. That's not good. Like, it's not data. It's not anything that I can meaningfully assess, which is why we rely on the assessment processes to have independent people analyze the data that's presented.
I think another problem is also how the media takes these research studies. So most of the time, a new study comes out and they just take the headline. And people obviously, they don't read the article, and that the media will just relay it how they want to relay it in the way that they want to relay it. And no one actually reads the article and actually sees, oh, that doesn't even say that. So the media has a huge part to play in how, I guess, science or medical journals are sort of taken. So
For sure.
Conversation, I mean, with my dad, for example, with regards to strength training, and my dad was just like, yeah, whatever. People just, you know, it's just a money-making scheme for people to go to the gyms. I'm like, no, there's actual evidence to show that it's really helpful for bone density and that sort of stuff, but they don't publish that. So media outlets will take that and then use that where it benefits them, and so other industries will take that where it benefits them and how it benefits them. So that's a huge part of the problem too, is how, you know, the media takes the headlines and how they want to present it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Jessica, you mentioned, if we could just go through this briefly, the 4 stages of the research process. Could you just briefly, really briefly, touch on what each stage looks like in terms of, you know, what kind of outcome do we get in the end?
Yeah, so the first 2 stages, the first stage is normally preclinical trials. So it will be like cell studies. They're looking, then it'll move on to a very, very small safety assessment for human trials.
Yes.
And then in stage 3, then they go on to human trials in a bigger number. And then stage 4 is normally post-market assessment, or once it's kind of met those thresholds. Now, the outcomes really depend on what the objective of the study is and what the, you know, so if we said we were trying to create a diabetes medication, then they would first have to prove in the cell studies that there's a mechanism for whatever this product is, or drug or whatever. They have to do this kind of proof of concept type testing first to even say that there's a hypothesis that this could work. So they go through that. And And then once they've gone, yep, we think this is our hypothesis, well, then we have to work out, well, what kind of dosing would be appropriate. So that's that kind of first human trials. So in that, so they'll do cells, and then they'll do animal studies often, or they'll do model. So there's a whole range of kind of ethical processes that they have to go for those. So that even that stage alone, like part 1 and part 2 can often take 10 years to do. So because studies don't happen, clinical trials don't happen overnight.
Yeah.
And often there's a lot of information that has to be found out, and then you go back one step. So then you got to start again. And then, so that preliminary phase of even kind of getting, okay, we think this is a good thing, can often take 10 years to do. And typically from start to finish, from like the initial trial of, say, developing a new drug to getting it on the market, it's a minimum of 10 years. So, which is also why we saw so much challenge around COVID, because it happened very quickly. And for a lot of people, that made them feel very uncomfortable, because we're told, no, normally it takes about 10 years to do this. And largely that is related to how many teams are working on the same issue at the same time, how much money is invested in it, how much information is actually available. And so that, for example, is like a real life example of why we actually could make it much quicker if we had the resourcing and the teams that were invested. But it's very, very rare to have hundreds of research teams working on the exact same issue at the same time. You normally have like a specialty lab that works on one issue. Yeah.
Thanks so much for breaking that all down. I think it puts a lot into perspective for listeners about just how rigorous the research process actually is, and how difficult it actually is in light of all that to actually make claims, but how claims can appeal to us as humans, especially those emotional aspects, and how easy it is for us to often get sucked in.
And a lot of times with certain vaccines, the funding stops. So people will say, well, how come, we've had the coronavirus before, we haven't had vaccines for that before? Because there wasn't funding. They started the process and there wasn't enough funding to continue with the whole vaccine process. So that was an issue as well.
When we're talking about research, we often sometimes talk about things like consensus. And, what do the broad, amount of researchers or studies, do they all kind of point towards the same thing? Do they not? So how does scientific consensus factor into determining the credibility of research findings? And how can listeners differentiate between genuine consensus or cherry-picked viewpoints?
Yes, great question. So there's a whole field of research called consensus methodology.
Yeah.
And so I do consensus methodologies in my type of research. And within those, it's about, so we use statistical methods within that. We will ask questions. For example, we'll say, do you believe that this issue is important? Or what do you believe is the acceptable range of X, Y, and Z based on the data? Like there's a whole range of different ways you could do it. But if you have an expert group, so the other thing with expert consensus is you have to define who an expert is first. So you have to say, why do I choose these people to be part of my study, to define a consensus? Like what is the expertise that we're looking for to be able to do that? So that's step 1. Step 2 then is actually asking the questions about, whether it's thresholds or whether it's agreement on, we agree that this range is the optimal for, whatever we're looking at, or, or have we missed anything else that you'd really like us to cover in this, or is there anything that should be removed? So that's then all analyzed statistically for agreement. So there's statistical methods that are called agreements. And so you then look for agreements in those methods, and then you keep going until you achieve a consensus. And so part of that process is removing things that are not part of the consensus group, like, a fringe group, only 30% of the experts think that this aspect should be X, Y, and Z. And so that's considered not a consensus reached. So the first thing is, defining who your experts are. The second one is there a process of which they used to achieve that consensus? And is all of that information transparent in some sort of, publication or documentation? So we see that with like cosmetic products, for example, like the European Societies of Cosmetics. They have these consensus meetings where they meet over a period of months. They discuss the issue that's being discussed, and they define what the parameters are based on the evidence and the literature that's available. So I think if you were looking at a statement that said, experts think, well, is that one expert? Is it a group of recognized experts? Is it some sort of formal documentation? If it is formal documentation, then is the process that they use transparent, or is it just a group of people that don't like what information is out there and they want to try and railroad it a different way? There's a lot of political motives behind expert consensus, which is where it can make it really tricky.
I was going to ask about that. So we saw, especially in the COVID time, the rogue expert was more likely to be believed and to be trusted than a group of them. Why do you think that's the case?
That's such a good question. I think that has to do with psychological resistance and psychological reactance. So in literature around science communication and beliefs and behavior change, we see that there's a number of factors that can influence why people will disregard what would be perceived as, well, it's logical that you should go with the group that have decided this. And some of that is because they feel that it strongly does not align with their personal values, or that it challenges what their kind of core beliefs are. And so that kind of causes this automatic visceral reaction to it, which then starts this domino effect of, well, this person is sticking their neck out to sacrifice their career. So what they're saying must be truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually remember that quite well. Yeah, now that you've mentioned it. And there was a lot of press during that time about these particular, anyway, we don't have to go into it too much. Can you provide us some examples, in history or things that you recall that have happened in the past where bad science has had a significant negative impact on society, and maybe extract some lessons that we can learn from those experiences?
Yes. Look, there's many. One of the common ones, and I think it's probably relevant right now with some of the American conversations that are happening at the moment. So one example is the Andrew Wakefield and measles issue that happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So I don't remember much of that as a child, because, I was born in the 80s. We probably were not aware of it so much as our parents were for this conversation. So for those that don't know, there was a study published by a then doctor. He's now lost his registration. And what happened was he published a case study with other colleagues, and basically claimed that he had proof that the measles vaccine was causing all sorts of health issues in children. Now, the problem was that it was bad science. It was a case study. So for those of you that aren't aware, a case study is like, you've looked after a patient in your hospital setting, or you've looked after a patient in your clinic, and there was something unusual about it. You've never seen it before. There's not a great deal of literature. And so you write essentially a blog post on this particular issue. Now, those things are quite useful because it helps clinicians, scientists to think about what research they might need to do. But case studies are not evidence for treatment models. They're not evidence. It's just this is an interesting point in time. I wonder what this means, and the rest of the community might be interested. So anyway, so this was the study. There was a number of issues with the study. They used markers that weren't recognized. There was a whole range of scientific things that were poorly done, and there was widespread critique from other experts in the area. So what's important to note is that this doctor did not have expertise in vaccines and all of that kind of stuff. So, but he was very smart, and he held a press conference, and the ramifications of that we continue to see because it kick-started discomfort and it raised questions. But part of the problem is that as a visceral response, many scientists will just respond and say, don't listen to this idiot, just listen to us. We're the ones that have the right information. Now, the problem is that kind of response is, as I said earlier, it's dismissive, but it's also flawed, because this person that published it was also an expert in another field. So you can't say one thing and have the other. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And so there's a lot of critique, a lot of critique about the way that scientists and health professionals communicated about this controversy, and that has had significant impacts. So the negative impacts were that we saw a drop in measles vaccination coverage, and we saw outbreaks. That then picked up, and then we're now seeing a lot of talk online again from very prominent people that are platforming ideas that have been proven false. However, facts don't get in the way of emotions. And that's largely what makes these things challenging, is that you're talking to parents and people that, deeply care about their children, and they would like to make sure that they make the right choice for their children. And when you have a scientist that gets up on a microphone and says, you should just listen to us, we're the ones with the right answers, that doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't appeal to the very human experience of worry, concern. And like you said, all parents have the best intentions for their children. No one wants to harm their kids. So appealing to where parents are at and really digging deeper to address those concerns, I think, is the most important thing than just saying, listen to us, we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, we need to really work hard to build trust and to demonstrate that we actually care about their concerns, and that we're willing to sit and hear them, and that we're willing to understand why they think that particular way, and to not just dismiss and say, well, that's silly, because you can't, you can't do that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's such a relevant example, the one that you just went through. And I think all parents will relate to that. And I think there's still very much prominent fears around that particular vaccine till today because of that press that sort of came about as a result. Moving from there, how can science communicators and health professionals like myself improve our delivery of evidence-based information? Are there any key sort of things that you think are really important for us to implement, especially in that social media online space?
Yeah, really good question. I think we could demonstrate more epistemic humility, which basically refers to this concept that we say we don't know when we don't know, or that we reflect that we don't believe in the God of science, if that makes sense. I think we could all benefit with having humility, and that would then influence the way that we communicate about it, and that we would hedge in some ways, that there are some things that we don't actually know, or there's things that we don't have the complete pieces of information to yet. So that's one thing. I think part of that humility then extends to empathy. It really can help us to be more empathetic to why people have questions. I think the third thing is don't take things personally. People are not necessarily offended by you. They might be offended by the ideas that you have because it challenges their belief systems. And so belief systems are nothing to do with you as a communicator. And it's really important to understand your community and to understand what matters to them and what will challenge their belief systems. And so how can we provide information in a way that reaffirms their values? Because so often we just want to come in and say, well, this is wrong, just got to move on with it, where maybe it's a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah, that was really helpful for me to hear, Jessica, because I think, you know, in terms of my approach in the online space, I like to have a laugh and be a little bit cynical about things. And I can definitely see that resonates with a lot of people. And there's a lot of people that do take offense to sort of my satirical approach to talking about different topics. And I think not being hard on yourself is so important, but especially that humility aspect, like being open to being corrected or being told, hey, this is my perspective, or hey, have you actually considered that this evidence might not be the best, or there's I've experienced that online a number of times, and I always welcome it because I think as a health professional, you don't know it all. And yeah, it's just so important to be open to looking at things differently, having an open mind.
I really love that you brought up humor too, because humor is important. And for some groups of people, you will reach them with humor far more than you will with just kind of a different method of communication. So humor is not bad, but you're right in that satire in particular can be quite offensive to people, depending on whether they perceive themselves to be the in-group or the out-group. I did it. One of the subjects that I've studied for my science communication degree was on humor, and it was really interesting. I did not realize that there are so many theories of humor.
Wow. Yeah. And how much of an impact it would have on, how people receive information.
Yeah. And I think like there's just different groups that, yes, humor will be the perfect thing for them.
Yeah. If we're looking at health professionals online and content that's posted by health professionals, what are some key things to look out for in spotting unethical practitioners? And do testimonials and storytelling fit into this discussion? And I'm really excited to hear your, response on this, especially as a health professional myself. I'm always wondering how to find that bridge between, talking about how you can help people, but also being ethical at the same time, and sort of working within those boundaries of what is allowed.
Yeah, so I think about ethical practice on social media from 5 perspectives. So the first 2 I combine, so confidentiality and privacy. And that is, how do you approach the information that you're sharing? And if you are sharing reflections from your practice, then think about ways that you can de-identify it even more than you think it's de-identified. So, for example, instead of telling a story about a male who's in this age range, change the gender, change the place and time. And I think I relate to how hard that is, because we feel connected to these stories, and part of the motivation for sharing is that you want to share something that means something to you. But from some research that's out there, even when things are de-identified, they're not as de-identified as you think. And so it's really good practice to think about, how could I make this more de-identified, and could I talk about this in generic terms? So within that, I feel deeply uncomfortable when practitioners will share what their clinic list looked like for the day, because what if your patient is on social media and they see that, chronic health condition was on there, and although that's not identifying, how does that make the patient feel? So they're kind of some things there. And so within that, I guess that kind of comes into testimonials as well. But I'll talk about testimonials from another angle, and that is professional boundaries. So that's the third one, is professional boundaries, thinking about you are in a position of power, whether you say you're not or what. As the practitioner, you're in a position of power. You're engaging with somebody that's in a vulnerable state, so you hold that piece of power. And so I think asking for testimonials or sharing testimonials can influence that power imbalance. And it's very easy for us to weaponize that power imbalance, because it's our job, I think, is part of it too. We like, well, we're just doing our job. And where for the patient, it's like a really important, or a client, it's a really important, vulnerable point in time. It's also really important to note that testimonials under the kind of legal guidelines are not permissible when it comes to clinical care, even if you are a so-called unregulated profession, because as an unregulated profession, you are obliged to adhere to the generic health workers code. And so a lot of those things, anyone that could be treated under the health workers code is considered to be a health professional, in the sense of like TGA code of advertising and testimonials, or general testimonials. So that can be sticky for people. So you can have testimonials that refer to your communication or how they made you feel, but they can't give testimonials around like, I went and saw Iman and now my chronic eczema is cleared up. That's a breach. You can't do that, because that's a disease claim.
Okay, that's interesting. So they can reflect on the experience and of working with you, but not in terms of, Iman helped me to get pregnant, for example.
Yeah. So you could say, Iman's clinic is beautiful and I felt so at home there with her. I would recommend, this clinic, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. And that's something that you can share in the online space.
Yes.
As it doesn't relate to a health related claim. Okay. That's great to know. I didn't know that, Jess. I learned something new.
Yeah. So it's, it's about that interaction and the communication.
Was that new for you?
Yeah. I probably wouldn't do that anyway. But yeah.
It's hard. It's really hard. Now, what were the others? So I've said confidentiality, privacy, professional boundaries.
Yes.
Online conduct is another one. So like just thinking about how you interact with people online versus offline. So what would be the equivalent of yelling or abusing somebody online versus face-to-face? And, so what behaviors would be unacceptable face-to-face? How do they translate to that online space? And just to note that even if you're not commenting on things in your professional responsibility or from your professional, like decisions can be made about your practice based on your conduct online, even if you're not saying I'm a naturopath or whatnot. So, and a lot of that is around discrimination. So we've seen a lot of instances where health practitioners have had their licenses suspended because they've made some sort of racist comment on Facebook to a news post. And then they've been reviewed and reported, and they've been told they're not, acting in a way that's acceptable conduct for a registered nurse, for example.
Yeah, because you represent that profession.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. To be honest, as a consumer, like if I was going to see another health professional or work with someone that I was following or looking at in the online space, I think that would actually deter me, like from booking in with them. Or like, seeing behavior that's
either about character.
That's either derogatory or like, inappropriate. 100%. It's about character.
You want to work with someone or have someone look after you who has has a good character, has some integrity.
Yeah. And then the final ethical principle that I think about when it comes to practitioners online is reputation. So how do you position yourself online? Who do you associate yourself with? What organizations are you affiliated with? When you got your training, who did you get your training with? All of those kinds of things can really help. And so being transparent about those things can be really helpful in demonstrating ethical. Like, for me, it's a red flag if a practitioner won't disclose, they say, oh, yeah, I'm a university qualified nutritionist. Okay, can you show me?
Yeah. Which university?
Which university? Oh, I don't feel comfortable telling you.
Is there
Why is that? Or I've seen people like they go, I'm a university qualified nutritionist. And so you can see that they're using that as a way to build the trust with their audience, right? To go, well, I'm qualified, I'm trained. Well, that's good. And then in the next breath, they say, oh, but I don't agree with a lot of the things that my university taught me. And I've learned so much more through other things. And you're like, so which is it? Are you university qualified or are you not?
Yeah, that's actually something that I see a lot used by naturopaths actually in the online space, because there are a lot of naturopaths that have either done a diploma like a long time ago. They were phased out, but they will often say things like, I'm a degree qualified naturopath in an effort to say like, I didn't do like a 5-week course.
Yeah.
But I've always found it an interesting way to advertise. It's never sort of something that I've felt drawn to say online.
Yeah, and look, and I'm not meaning it in the classist sense that like, oh, because you don't have a bachelor degree, you're no good. Like, I do not mean that at all. But I mean, if you're going to promote that you have a qualification, then please be transparent to share where you got that qualification from. Because when it comes to especially for unregulated spaces, it becomes really important where you got your training from.
So true.
And was your provider a registered training organization?
Well, now
or were they just an online course that somebody developed and called it a certification?
Yeah, I had this discussion with a friend of mine who's a PT recently, because she said that she was doing a nutrition course, and people were asking her about the course that she was doing, and she was basically resharing bits and pieces from the course provider saying that this will equip you to sort of, be really knowledgeable in the field of women's health. You can work with XYZ. And I thought, hang on, what kind of a course who is the provider of this course, and how does this sit above a bachelor degree nutrition qualification? Like, I need to look into this. And when I did, I found that it was just a bunch of experts or people that had been working in the field that have come together under a banner of like a nutrition sort of, brand or business organization, whatever you want to call it, and are running courses for PTs to like excel their nutrition in like their knowledge base, but also to treat like women's health stuff and all these other things. And they're basically saying this is above, like you're going to learn more than what you would learn in a degree somewhere else. And I thought, and I had to like say to her, look, listen, like this is actually really not, this is really incorrect. Like, this is actually wrong. Like, you can't make all these claims that you're going to work with these people and work with all of these things based on this qualification, which is not even recognized. Like, just because 5 naturopaths and nutritionists came together and said, we're going to put together this course for you to be equipped to treat XYZ conditions, doesn't mean you actually can, right? Without a baseline fundamental in terms of like a, formal education. So it's interesting what is starting to spring up in the online space in terms of education, because I'm seeing a lot more organizations coming out over the last year that are running courses and saying that you're going to be qualified to do XYZ when that's actually not appropriate.
Pathways. People are so, as well, with the online space, I'm seeing now, holistic practitioner, wellness, I don't even know what that is. What is that?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
And they just put health or wellness in their bio and immediately they're qualified. Health coach, holistic coach. What the heck is that, man? Wellness coach.
Yeah.
What that is. What is that?
I think it just goes back to, like Jess said, because we're unregulated, being transparent about what you're doing is so important. Be transparent. To wrap up, Jess, are there any reliable sources or platforms that you recommend for our listeners to stay up to date on scientific advancements, research, or just places that they can access trustworthy information in general when it comes to health?
Other than us, of course.
Yeah, that's not us.
Yeah, look, I find this a tricky one to answer because things change and what might be reliable right now, sometimes things shift. But look, what I do normally recommend to people is when you're starting out to look for information and you're starting to try and get a sense of what the consensus is or what the most up-to-date information is, go to like .gov.au websites or .edu.au websites as a starting point. So you'll see, so for other examples might be if you go to a specialist body. So like if you're wanting to find out something about women's health or something about birthing and things like that, and you really weren't quite sure, if you go to the College of Obstetricians and the College of Midwives websites, they normally have position statements or consensus statements. Now they are, what the challenge with these kind of websites is sometimes they're not good at updating quickly. Like they'll have had a meeting, but it takes a while to get the update. But that's a really good starting point to kind of think, okay, I'm going to start by looking at what's the general kind of piece of information that's known. So that's what I would recommend is go to kind of specialist bodies or, .gov.au or .edu.au to get a general idea first. And then you can use the C.R.A.B.S framework, like use the C.R.A.B.S framework on those too, to work out, like, do they say who the author is? Are there references, etc.?
Yeah, I think I know even as a health professional, I tend to sometimes send clients even resources from government websites because they are up to date, they're reliable generally.
They summarize it in layman terms.
Yeah, they're quite concise.
Yeah.
Exactly, layman's terms, easy to understand. So I find that they're quite valuable.
They have a lot of tools, like clinic tools as well, Diabetes Australia,
healthy lunchbox, ideas, just, things like that, meal plan, like, lunchbox planners and things like that. There are all sorts of gems I find on government websites. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with Jessica. Our listeners, Jessica. I learned so much, just myself, in that episode, and what am I trying to say?
I don't know, but
what am I actually trying to say
right now?
Yeah,
I'm trying to hold it in. I'm like, don't cough.
Maybe Mary, you can go get your cough on if you need it somewhere else. I think, okay, we're probably going to cut this part out because
why not? Why?
I'm like, have we wrapped up?
It's sitting right there.
For our listeners, we will share in our show notes where they can find you as well. Yeah. So Jessica, you're quite active in the online space. You also do run workshops where people can find out more information on your website. Is that correct?
Correct.
Amazing. And
you run workshops. That's cool.
Yeah.
On C.R.A.B.S specifically.
On science communication, and also on ethics for health professionals and all. If you followed her closely enough,
I was
then you would know, right? But everyone's
you're slipping, Mariam.
Everyone says they're a fan, but are they really?
They're clearly not a super fan.
Not obsessed.
So we'll wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for our listeners. We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did, and we will catch you guys soon in our next episode, which will be dropping in about 2 weeks. We're gonna put it. We're gonna do it.
You don't want her to mention it? No.
Would you like to mention your Instagram handle?
My Instagram handle is J_Stokes Parish.
Oh, right. Amazing.
Awesome.
All right, I'm just gonna.
Thanks.